what I want to do now, as we get into Exodus, is actually start in Genesis, okay? So, Rick, could I get you to go to the very end of Genesis? And I'm going to have you read the very last chapter, verses 24 through 26. And then April, I'm going to have you read Exodus chapter 1, verses 1 through 7. Okay? So follow along here as they read those two things. So Rick, you want to go ahead with that 24 through 26?
Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised an oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Joseph made the sons of Israel swear an oath and said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place. So Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt.
Okay, now, April, when you read this, I want you to begin the very first verse with the word and. Okay, even though it's not in your Bible. Say, start with and.
Okay. And now these are the names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt. Each man and his household came with Jacob. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. And all those who were descendants of Jacob were 70 persons, for Joseph was in Egypt already. And Joseph died, all his brothers, and all that generation. But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, and multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them.
Okay, now, even though our versions don't start with and, in the Hebrew it does. In Hebrew, the first word is and. In fact, in Leviticus and Numbers, it also starts with and. And so you see how seamlessly one book flows right into the other. And it kind of gives a little bit of credence to the fact that one person probably wrote all of that. And it's almost like these are not individual books, but all chapters of the same one.
So it's like a continuum.
It's like a continuum, yes. All right. So I just wanted to see how seamlessly they flow from one to the next. Now, from what Rick just read in Genesis, Joseph prophecies that there would come a time when God will visit. And he says it twice, and that's emphasis. And it brings them out of Egypt and into the promised land. It will be God's doing. Okay? And Joseph, that lucky guy, got to experience the embalming process, although he probably wouldn't have been aware of it at the time. Now, so the generation of those who had come into Egypt with the sons of Israel are now gone. Now, notice the dual use of the patriarch's name, Israel and Jacob. Now, remember that Jacob's name was changed by God to Israel. And from here on out, the nation will be referred to as Israel. And the people themselves were called Hebrews. Okay? But they did what God had told humans to do way back in the beginning. They multiplied. And I'm just guessing that it didn't take a lot of convincing to get them to do that. And we know that it was about 400 years from Jacob's family coming into Egypt until the events in Exodus. But how much of that time were they in servitude? Okay, James, I gave you something from Genesis 15.
And God said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. But I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions.
Okay, so 400 years. They said they will be in servitude for 400 years, right? So we need to hold that thought, and we'll read on. Barbara, can I get you to read verses 8 through 14?
Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from their land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and bricks and in all kinds of work in the fields. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves.
So if I read this correctly, all this fruitfulness and a new Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph occurred fairly early in the 400 years. And it must have been a pretty short honeymoon with Joseph's favorable Pharaoh and the granting of the best of the land of Goshen. The land of Goshen, by the way, is in the Nile Delta, and it's way up here in the northeast corner. It's right up here. All right. So now it takes a little bit of speculative history here to sort this out. Now there is a lot of evidence for nomadic Semitic tribes from the east entering the Nile Delta right here along the eastern edge of it. And they would usually do this for food for themselves and their livestock whenever food was scarce. Now sometime during the first half of the 2nd century BC, that would be from 2000, somewhere between 2000 and 1500 BC, there was a Semitic tribe from the east called the Hyksos, and that's how you spell it right there. And they came into the Delta region, and they became so strong that they're able to kick the Egyptians out of Lower Egypt, and they made them move to Upper Egypt all the way down. They made their capital in Thebes. That would be the Egyptians were kicked out. They moved all the way down here and made their capital city Thebes here. And the Hyksos then ruled Lower Egypt for about 100 years, and that's history. Okay? Now here's the speculation part, and I think this kind of makes a lot of sense. Joseph's Pharaoh was one of these Hyksos kings, and it would have been more favorable toward Joseph's family since they were both Semitic nomads, and would have been more likely to elevate Joseph to his high position. And besides that, the Egyptians despised shepherds for some reason. But when the Egyptians reconquered Lower Egypt, an Egyptian pharaoh then sat on the throne. And it's reasonable to imagine that this new pharaoh would regard any outside group of Semites with great suspicion, especially one that was multiplying like rabbits. So he was not about to let this happen again. And any group that had been shown special favor by the Hyksos would fall out of favor under the new pharaoh. Now, while the population of the Israelites, with the population of the Israelites in Egypt growing and becoming mighty, this pharaoh recognized the potential of Israel rising up and doing what the Hyksos had done. Okay, now, besides this, the Hebrews must have had some economic value that the Pharaoh didn't want to lose. And for this Pharaoh not knowing Joseph, it's possible that he knew who Joseph was, even though Joseph was gone by then. Okay, but he wouldn't acknowledge Joseph's status or any of his accomplishments since he had been aligned with the Hyksos. Okay. Now, so that is speculation, but it makes a lot of sense. Okay.
And where did they kind of come from? You said they were
They
nomadic or what?
came from the east.
Okay.
Yeah, they came from the east, just like the Hebrews did.
But they were strong enough and large enough?
They were
to
strong
move
enough
the
and big
Egyptians
enough that
out.
they grew, and they were able to kick the Egyptians out of this area. Their capital city was right here, it was Memphis.
Huh.
It was right here, which is right next to where Cairo is today. They kicked the Egyptians out, and they moved all the way down here. Not nearly as nice a place as it is up here.
Hmm.
Okay, but they lasted for about 100 years, and then they got kicked out by the Egyptians. Okay, all right, so now, with all of this, Pharaoh devises Plan A, and he subjects the Israelites to involuntary servitude. And this involved hard labor in brick making and as farm laborers. And this was a long ways from their normal work as shepherds. And taskmasters were placed over them to make their lives especially miserable. And contrary to some beliefs, and I mentioned this before with the slideshow, that the Hebrews did not build the pyramids. Okay, now, by this time, the pyramids had been there for 1,000 years already. Okay, but they did build some store cities in Ramses and Pithom. They're not listed on here, but they are up in this Goshen area right up in here. Now, these stores, like I said, they're the eastern part of the Delta. Now, I heard somebody ask, what is a store city? Okay? So when a particular pharaoh was in power, he would have his own temples, and he would have his own set of priests who would carry out the worship of him as a god. But when he died, and a new pharaoh took the throne, the new pharaoh would have new temples built, and he would have new priests. And this would cause the worship of the old pharaoh to die out and put his priests out of a job. And so the old pharaoh would have store cities built while he was still alive that would provide for the old priests and for the maintenance of his temples, so the worship of him as a god could continue after his death. Okay? And this is what the Hebrews were required to build. Now, it was common in the ancient world for the common people to be forced to work for a part of the year as a form of taxation. And in Egypt, this was the case while they were waiting for the Nile floodwaters to recede. But it was also common for certain vulnerable groups to be forced into extra labor if a project required it. Now, brick making, as you saw, was a dirty, miserable job, and it was really reserved for the lowest. And literally millions of bricks would be needed for these building projects. But Plan A failed. And the greater the affliction, the more the population of Israelites grew. Now, how those two things relate, I have no idea. All right, let's read on. Nancy, you want to read 15 through 22?
Sure. Then Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, gave this order to the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah, whatever, and Puah. When you help the Hebrew women as they give birth, watch as they deliver. If the baby is a boy, kill him. If it's a girl, let her live. But because the midwives feared God, they refused to do the king's orders. They allowed the boys to live too. So the king of Egypt called the midwives. Why have you done this? He demanded. Why have you allowed the boys to live? The Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, the midwives replied. They are more vigorous and have their babies so quickly that we cannot get there in time. So God was good to the midwives, and the Israelites continued to multiply, growing more powerful. But because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. Throw every newborn Hebrew boy into the Nile River, but you may let the girls live.
So Plan A doesn't work, so enter Plan B. Now, it isn't possible to know the timeline of these events because they just really aren't spelled out that very well here in the text, whether they occurred early in the 400 years or later, more toward the birth of Moses. But I have to believe that these two midwives are not the only midwives to the Hebrews, because they couldn't possibly service the entire crowd. And more likely they're mentioned because they were the only ones who defied Pharaoh. Now, notice that they're named, but Pharaoh isn't. That's unusual in Scripture. But God must have considered them more worthy of mention because they feared God, which is mentioned twice. And their fear of God was played out in their faithfulness to Him rather than obeying Pharaoh.
But, you know, there's something, what's interesting about this is that God has a plan, and He's going to execute His plan. And it doesn't really matter what Pharaoh's going to do, his plan's going to prevail. He's going to do it. But what's interesting is the people of Israel are going to go through a really hard time. And it's just interesting, because, so Israel goes through a really hard time. And it's just like with us, I mean, I know in our lives, even in the congregation or wherever, it's just, because we go through a hard time, doesn't mean God forgot about us, and it doesn't mean that his plan won't prevail, because he's going to execute it. But during this time, it's like I could just picture myself in that group thinking, this is horrible. Where are you at? I pray to you, and I have to be out here making bricks. And this is just terrible. Have you forgotten your people? It's like I could just see, just like you were saying, I'm gonna be whining like nobody's business right now, thinking, where are you? Why did you do this? How could you, if you loved, here's the phrase, if you loved us, why would you let this happen to us? But it's like, and it's like, there's a huge lesson to me in this, just that you watch it, but God is busy at work. Because every time Pharaoh keeps coming up with a new grand idea who has all the power in his hands, it doesn't work. It just keeps blowing up. And every time he does it, it just keeps furthering what God does. And the harder he squeezes, the more it happens. And it just, and God just, and his people thrive. They keep expanding, they keep multiplying. And it's like the problem gets worse for Pharaoh. And God's gonna, and then God has faithful people in there who do amazing things. And I love Pharaoh's comments like, why did you do this? And it's like, he's frustrated. Because God's gonna keep frustrating all of his plans, and at the end, God's gonna win. And it just, but the thing is, it doesn't mean that the journey's not hard, and it doesn't mean there's not gonna be suffering. And it doesn't mean that I probably won't be whining. But he's got a plan. I think it's just, I think it just goes to show it's easy to go through a text like this for me to read this and go, oh yeah, you know, and everything was merrily, happily ever after. It's like, no, there were hard times.
They were.
So anyway, I'm sorry, I didn't want to.
Well, that's good, and, yeah, and to add on to that though, not only are they hard times, but God has a reason for it.
Mhm.
There's purpose in it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and there's purpose in all of that, and you're right, it was hard times. And we don't, when you just read it, you don't really get the sense of how desperate they were.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
When Barb read verse 12, the way her version read it, it said that, I don't know, mine says Israelites multiplied and spread. Do you think that they were still, like Pharaoh kept them in that region still? Or do you think that they started moving out?
I think they moved out, because in my version here, it says that they more they multiplied and the more they spread abroad. So I'm suggesting that perhaps there was so many of them, they couldn't all stay in one spot. They had to.
So they got further out of the land of Goshen,
Could
so is
very
that
well
kind
be.
of part of the reason why Pharaoh was getting so
It's
upset?
very,
Because they
very
were-
possible, yeah.
He was afraid they might push him down like the other guy had been? Is
Well, you
that-
know, and you get that many males of soldiering age, and you have an army, and
Yeah.
the possibility existed, as with the Hyksos. And Hyksos, incidentally, were very innovative. They were the ones who built for the first time a lot of different war machines, including the chariot, by the way. I read that was actually a Hyksos invention. So, you know, they were an interesting group of people.
Hmm.
And Pharaoh didn't want this to happen again.
Had you ever seen anything that indicated how many children, babies were killed?
No. You know, the only way we could possibly know, well, unless they were, you know, in the Egyptian writings, which as far as I know, no one's ever seen any of that. It's just what we can know from here. Yeah, Karen?
You know, one of the great lessons for me was this whole idea of, with the midwives, how they feared God more than they feared man. And then how God blessed them for that. And I just think in my own life how often I operate in the fear of man. You know, whether it's worrying about what people will think or what people will say or how I'll be, you know, seen, or, you know, when the fear of man keeps me silent when I should speak, or makes me say what I don't even believe, you know. And so it's just a really good reminder that God will bless us when we fear him more than we fear man.
And the consequences of fearing God are not always good,
Mhm.
but the reward is not necessarily here.
Mhm. Yeah.
You know, even when he told Abraham, you know, when I think about it, your kids and your grandkids and your great-grandkids and your great-great-grandkids, it's gonna be dark for hundreds of years. And Abraham didn't say, what the heck? What do you mean? I've been faithful to you. And, you know, I mean, he knew God. He knew him and knew what was coming and was still, man, I'll follow you until I take my last breath. And right now, with everything going on in the world, we've got to have that. We've got to have our roots go down deep, because storms are coming left and right, and we have to have that kind of trust that says, no matter what, I'm gonna just keep going straight, you know? I admire that in Abraham and Moses, just, you know, not looking at what's going on, but just looking here, no matter what.
A former pastor one time made the comment that the problem really isn't in the politics of the world today or anything like that. He said the problem really is that there aren't enough believers in the world. Our job isn't to change the politics, our job is to make more believers.
Mhm.
So then things will really change.
Politics are always downstream of culture. Yeah, it's the hearts that we need to be after.
All right, so, with Plan B, and with the midwives here, even though it says elsewhere that the Israelites worshipped the gods of the Egyptians, there was still a thread of belief in the one true God. So the midwives come up with this ruse.
How did the Egyptian midwives know about God? Was it,
These weren't Egyptian midwives, these were Hebrew midwives.
oh, they were Hebrew?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So anyway, the ruse they come up with, what they told Pharaoh, might have been partially true, and they were not always able to get to the births on time, but it wouldn't have always been the case. And so the bottom line is they lied. I mean, they lied, there's no getting around it, and even so, God commended them for it and he rewarded them. And it might be hard for us to swallow that, because particularly the prophets among us here. But to understand this, one needs to understand the mindset here. Now, for one thing, the law against false witness had not been given yet. They hadn't been to Mount Sinai yet. There was no law. And besides that, to the Hebrews, there was a hierarchy of right and wrong. Some wrongs were worse than other wrongs. So it was permissible to violate a lesser wrong to prevent one from committing a greater wrong. Okay, now we see this actually in the gospel account of the man asking Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? And he wanted to know Jesus' take on what was the one commandment that was at the top that could not be violated in favor of any others. Now remember too that this is narrative, and moral judgments are not always included in the story. Okay, right, but Plan B doesn't work either, thanks at least in part to the faithful midwives. And so Plan C is to have all the Egyptians in on it. And he commands them to throw every male child born into the Nile. And this is kind of ironic, the Nile being the source of life in Egypt and killing Hebrew children in it. And again, Pharaoh's fear is that the Hebrews are going to grow into a powerful enough army to do what the Hyksos had done and overthrow the Egyptians again. And Moses doesn't tell us how successful this Plan C is, but there's a lot of males making the trip out of Egypt. Okay? And also we don't know how faithful the Egyptians were in obeying this commandment. After all, how hard would it be to throw a newborn baby into the river? You know, but the plan is in effect at Moses' birth, as we'll see here in just a little bit. Now, I want you to notice in verse 22 there, the words every son. Now, if we look ahead to chapter 4, God instructs Moses to tell Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son. And I say to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. And if you refuse to let him go, behold, I will kill your firstborn son. And we know God is true to his promises, and this is exactly what happens. And not only is Pharaoh's firstborn killed, but every Egyptian's firstborn. God does Pharaoh one better, as he always does. You think you're powerful? Watch this. So the stage is now set for the entrance of Moses. Who did we read last? Nancy, did you read? James, you want to read chapter 2, verses 1 through 5? Okay.
Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi, and the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got him a wicker basket and covered it over with tar and pitch. Then she put the child into it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. And his sister stood at a distance to find out what would happen to him. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the Nile with her maidens, walking alongside the Nile, and she saw the basket about among the reeds, and sent her maid, and she brought it to her.
Now, in this chapter, Pharaoh has 2 chances to get rid of Moses ahead of the Exodus, but God says no. God has his plan. And we see here that Moses comes from the tribe of Levi, and he's pure Levite since both parents are from that tribe. And later on, we'll learn that God instructs that through Aaron, Moses' brother would come the priestly line. Now, Moses' birth, his mother determined that he was a fine child, and the Hebrew reads, she saw him that he was good, meaning that he was healthy and he had no defects. And so she kept him from being thrown in the Nile till he was 3 months old. Still pretty little. And by the time had come when she didn't feel she could keep his existence a secret any longer. And up to this time, she had already taken a big risk. So she waterproofs the basket and places the baby in it in the shallows among the reeds of the Nile River. Now for you moms, I know you can imagine the emotional trauma here. What would it take for you to be able to do this? It had to be a desperate, last-ditch, do-or-die effort to save her child's life.
But didn't she kind of do what Pharaoh told them to do, put the child in the river?
She did,
In a
yeah.
modified way?
In a modified way. Well, but, that to keep the child at home any longer would have certainly been the death of the child. And putting the child in the reeds certainly wasn't not a sure thing, because crying baby could attract crocodiles or even the wrong person, or if nobody found the child, could die of exposure. So, it was a pretty desperate move. Now, some people have related this basket incident to the ark that Noah built.
Oh, yes.
Some ones being saved through the waters. And to this I say, why not? Seems like a good connection. Chris, you want to read verses 6 through 10, please?
Where's number 6? There it is, alright. She opened it and saw the child. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This is the one of the Hebrew babies. She said then just a second. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you? Yes. Go, she answered. And the girl went and got the baby's mother, and Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this baby and nurse him for me, and then I will pay you. So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, She took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water.
Moses' sister's watching all these things, and I can't imagine in her and her mother's wildest expectations that things would turn out this well. God provides over and above anything we can hope or imagine. God is moving the pieces here. And for Miriam, being of a slave class, to even address the daughter of the Pharaoh took some courage. It could have gone badly for her. And like the midwives and Moses' mom, and here again we see a woman's bravery. They're being instrumental in God's overall plan. So not only does Moses' mom see her precious son saved from almost certain death, but she gets to be the one who cares for him for the first few years of her life and gets paid for it. Now, is God amazing or what? So Moses gets his name from his adopted mother, and the Hebrew verb for to draw out is masha. And the Egyptian word for son also has a similar sound. So there could have been a dual purpose in her choice of names here. And also the Egyptian name Moses is used in many Egyptian names, like Tutmos and Ramesses. It has Moses as part of the name. And it means to father or be born of. And one commentator pointed out a bit of symbolism in her choice of words here, since God draws Israel as his son out of Egypt. Not just in this Exodus, but again in the early life of Jesus. And this narrative leaves a lot of unanswered questions. What was Moses like in Pharaoh's household? Did Pharaoh know of Moses' origin? Why did he allow one of his daughters to adopt a child, let alone a Hebrew child? Was Pharaoh's daughter a harem child? And what was her status? Did the daughter marry and have more children? How did that impact Moses' upbringing? And could the Pharaoh who wouldn't let Israel go have been one of Moses' stepbrothers or maybe a cousin? No.
I was just wondering if the two people groups had similar features and complexions.
I don't think so. I don't think so. I was going to use this as an example, but doesn't really apply. I don't know whether they would or not. They're both from basically the same part of the country of the world, but they're actually from two different lines from Noah. Okay, one are the Hamites, or Egyptians are Hamites,
Right.
but the Hebrews are Shemites. So they come from two distinct, different lines.
When we were in Egypt, I mean, I don't know if clear back then, but when we were in Egypt, I thought the Egyptians looked very Middle Eastern.
Looked what?
Very Middle Eastern. They looked, I wouldn't have probably known if somebody was an Egyptian or a Jew, but that's today, so who knows, clear back then. I thought the Egyptians were a little darker colored, but, I mean, the Israelis are a variety that way, so, but in general, a little darker, but very Middle Eastern looking, not African looking. So,
I always thought
who knows back then?
I always thought that Israelis look, of course, Israelis come from all parts of the world too.
Right,
Some of them are just very, very light skinned, red hair even, But to me, they've always looked kind of Mediterranean, like Italian, Greek, that.
Yeah, a little bit, yeah.
Well, anyway.
So why couldn't, how would they know that they were the Hebrews' babies? Just throw them in the river then? I mean,
Well,
just by-
they probably kept to themselves. They probably lived in their own areas. Besides that, excuse me, they were all brick making and.
What about circumcision?
That's a good question. We're going to get to that.
Okay.
Maybe not today,
Okay.
but we will get to that. Okay, but anyway, for now, Moses is safe and sound, and his birth family knows it. God is working. Harvey, you want to take 11 through 15, please?
Sure. Now it came about in those days when Moses had grown up that he went out to his brethren and looked on their hard labors. and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So he looked this way and that, and when he saw that there was no one around, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. He went out the next day, and behold, two Hebrews were fighting with each other. And he said to the offender, "Why are you striking your companion?" But he said, "Who made you prince or a judge over us? Are you intending to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and said, "Surely the matter has become known."
So here we get to the crime. In Acts 7, in Stephen's speech before his stoning, he said Moses was 40 years old when this incident happened. I find it interesting that Moses' life is divided into 3 40-year segments. In the Hebrew mind, 40 was considered the age of understanding. And 40 is also the number of testing or trials. Remember 40 days and nights of rain and 40 days in the wilderness. And they spent 10 40-year periods in Egypt there. So here we have 40 years 3 times. This is too big of a coincidence to be accidental. There has to be meaning here, and if you figure out what it is, let me know.
So,
But-
go ahead.
Huh?
I was just gonna say, who told Moses that he was a Hebrew?
Did he know that?
He had to, well, he evidently knew it. And I have to believe this isn't the first time he ever went out among his people. And I think he was perfectly aware of what their plight was. But,
Well, how old do you think he was before his mother had to take him into the palace? So did he know who his mother was? Did he go visit her ever? 'Cause
we don't know any of that.
I'd like to know that.
More unanswered questions about Moses' life.
I was gonna say, wasn't it when Charlton Heston saw the blanket? It's like, he got out, he was Hebrew. This is the Charlton Heston's version of it.
Well, you want to know, just watch the
Incredible. Yeah.
All those bad Bible stories, like, we
I
call them, hey, let's watch this series of bad Bible stories. And so we'll watch it, I'm always, Kim just loves to watch.
Well, it's like the
Yeah.
famous thing where Charlton Heston's holding up the staff for the crossing of the sea in the movie, and he's got a wristwatch on. You can see the wristwatch. It's in the movie. It's one of the famous faux pas of it.
Great job of editing.
He's got his Rolex on, going. Yes, we're going to see.
Oh, brother.
That was probably Timex.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. He was a famous thing.
Well, anyway, from verse 11, we see that Moses identifies himself with the Hebrews. He is aware of his origin. And it says he looked on their burdens. And like I said, I can't believe this is the first time that he was aware of what was going on there. But from the rest of the account of Moses' life, we see that he had very little tolerance for injustice.
Yeah.
And apparently seeing one of his own being beaten was too much. And the fact that he checked out the scene and didn't see anyone implies that the one being beaten had left, and Moses was left alone with the beater. And it also implies that this was calculated. It was a calculated, premeditated action. And besides that, he dug a hole and hid the guy in it. And today we could make a case for a charge of first-degree murder. Moses was guilty of a serious criminal act. And how it became known is not told, but it becomes well known enough that not only did the other Hebrews know about it, but so did Pharaoh. And he wasn't happy. Adopted family member or not, we don't know the relationship this Pharaoh had with Moses. But this was not going to be tolerated. And one did not kill an Egyptian taskmaster for doing what he was instructed to do. And besides that, Moses being 40 years old, besides that, Moses being 40 years old, the father of his adopted mother was likely dead by now. Okay, so this was probably a new Pharaoh. And besides that, the death penalty was the Pharaoh's domain. And here was someone from his household, maybe, usurping his authority. And notice the response of the 2 Hebrews who were fighting. Who made you prince and judge over us? And Moses is going to face this same question over and over again from the Israelites repeatedly during their wilderness journey. And so Moses beats a hasty escape all the way to Midian. Midian is typically, I'm not gonna be able to see it on here, because this thing is right square in the way. But Midian is on the east side, typically you'll see it listed on the east side of the Gulf of Aqaba, over here. Okay, that's where Midian is. However, the borders fluctuated throughout history, and at times the land of Midian actually extended over into the Sinai Peninsula too. So we don't know when that was in history or what exactly the borders were. But Moses had to have traveled quite a ways in a very dry and dusty land. Now, one commentator points out how Moses, in a way, is repeating the actions of Abraham's servant and Jacob in obtaining a wife. And I guess wells were the place to go in those days to meet some women, since there weren't a lot of singles bars around. But,
There's a water bar, go to the well.
go to the well, yeah.
Wow.
A lot of babes at the well. But,
Oh my gracious. Hey, baby.
but like the incident with the beaten Hebrew slave, we see Moses' reaction to injustice here in saving the women from being driven away from the water source. And I think we will stop there, and we will pick that up in verse 16 next time.